Hello, Cloud Gurus, and welcome to this lecture. And this lecture is all about troubleshooting logging and some of the common issues that you might see when trying to configure logging. So let's get started. So in this first scenario, we have our user on the left who is spinning up Lambda functions and creating S3 buckets. And we want all of their API activity to be logged to CloudTrail. But for some reason, no logs are appearing in our CloudTrail S3 bucket. And in this situation, the main things I would check for are firstly, is the CloudTrail actually enabled? Have you specified the correct bucket name? And does the S3 bucket have the correct permissions? Or is there maybe a bucket policy or access control list which is preventing CloudTrail from writing logs to the bucket? And the last thing I would check is if you're looking for S3 or Lambda data events, then they are not enabled by default because they do tend to be really high volume and they also do incur added costs. So they do not enable them by default. So let me show you what I mean about that in the console. So here I am in the console and I'm going to go down to Management and Governance and find CloudTrail. So just click on CloudTrail and I'm going to create a new CloudTrail. So click on Create Trail, give it a name, call it My Trail. And just scroll down here to Data Events. Now, Data Events applies to both S3 and Lambda, and they provide insights into the resource operations performed on or within a resource. And do be aware that additional charges apply. And if you want to find out more about the additional charges, you can just go in and open that link and you can read all about the different CloudTrail pricing for data events. But basically, you're going to be charged at 10 cents per 100,000 events. So they don't enable this by default, and you'll need to go in and explicitly enable this if you want this. So for S3, it's going to record S3 object level API activity. So for example, if someone does a get object or put object for an individual bucket, and you can specify which buckets you want this to apply to down here. So you can either have it apply to all buckets in your account, or you can add a bucket and add the name of your bucket. And then for Lambda, you can record invoke API operations for individual functions or for all current and future functions within your AWS account. So you can go in and just check all for all current and future functions, or you can just select the Lambda functions for which you want to record the API operations. So what I wanted to show you really is that this is not enabled by default. And if you do have a scenario where you're looking for either S3 or Lambda data events, so the invoke API operations for individual functions, and for S3, the S3 object level API activity, then you do need to make sure that is explicitly enabled in your CloudTrail. So moving on to our next scenario. So another situation you might encounter is that you need to provide access to your CloudTrail logs to a specific user. And maybe that's an external auditor or a user in your security team. And for some reason, they're not able to read the logs. So the first thing that I would check in this situation is, does the auditor's account have read-only access to CloudTrail configured? And there is a pre-configured identity access management policy called AWS CloudTrail read-only access. And you just need to make sure that that policy is attached to either the user or their identity access management group. And I'm just going to show you what I mean in the console, because of course, by default, ordinary identity access management users don't get access to CloudTrail logs by default, and you do need to explicitly define access to CloudTrail. So here I am back in the console, and I'm just going to go down to Identity Access Management, go to my users, and I'm just going to select one of my users which doesn't have admin access, go to Add Permissions, attach existing policies directly, and I'm just going to search for CloudTrail, and this is the policy that we're looking for, AWS CloudTrail read-only access. And in the description, it just tells us provides read-only access to AWS CloudTrail. So that is the policy that you need to add if you've got a user who needs to access CloudTrail and they are unable to access. So let's move on to some of our exam tips. If you're expecting to see CloudTrail logs in an S3 bucket and they are not appearing, definitely check that the CloudTrail is enabled. And it's important to remember that S3 and Lambda data events are high volume, so they are not enabled by default, and you're going to need to go in and explicitly enable them. And finally, check that you have provided the correct S3 bucket name and that there's nothing in the S3 bucket policy or access control lists which is preventing CloudTrail from writing logs to the bucket. And if you have a user who is having trouble accessing the CloudTrail logs, then check that your user has read-only access to CloudTrail enabled. And to do that, you just add the AWS CloudTrail read-only access policy to your user, and then they should be able to access the logs. So that is everything that I wanted to tell you about troubleshooting logging. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.